very basic anatomy, basic ganglia talk, plus also imaging in deep brain simulation. Because in the last workshop, a lot of people asked me, which MRI sequences should we run, or what's the best protocol, and so on. And I'm probably even not the best person to answer this. So I'm not an MR physicist or so. But I will just show you some examples of really good images and maybe our suggestions, what we thought is a good idea. And the other thing about anatomy and function of the basal ganglia, I'm also not the perfect person to give this talk. So there might be people here that have much more knowledge about this. But I still think it might be interesting, especially for people that are more technical. That so the doctors here may probably know most of the things I'll show, but some more technical people that for them it might be a good start about what basal ganglia are and so on. So really quickly, this is a view of the basal ganglia, and just a few nomenclatures. We have the chordate nucleus here, putamen, and nucleus accumbens. These three, and together they form the striatum. And then we have the pallidum, which the internal pallidum is really an important part where we stick electrodes in some diseases. And then we have, of course, the subthalamic nucleus, and we have the substantia nigra divided into two parts. So very, very broad overview of the basal ganglia. And then, that's substantia nigra. And then these are really cool videos, I think, from Canada actually, where you can show these anatomical slides. I won't show you the whole video, but just as a suggestion, if you're interested in neuroanatomy, there's a lot online to look at videos like that. Really good, great explanations of all the structures and everything. So that's really cool. And then just a few notes about history of how we even started doing deep brain simulation or lesioning before that. And again, I'm not the perfect person and not a really expert, of course, on history because I'm so young, but at least I try. So so maybe the first important marker was in the early 1900s that people thought striatum was associated with the control of muscle tone. And again, the striatum is this big region out here. And there was just an early link between basal ganglia and movement disorders. So very early hints. And then I think a very important part was to find out that lesions of the subthalamic nucleus were associated with hemibalism. So hemibalism is this movement disorder. Usually it's unilateral, so only on one side, where you have these ballistic and fast movements of one limb. And if people had a stroke here, there was an association with these ballistic movements. And there are newer studies that show that we have a lot of hemibalism patients without any stroke inside the subthalamic nucleus. So it might not be the STN itself that does hemibalism, but rather a network involved where the STN is involved. But still, it was an, I think, historical landmark to show that the STN originally was thought to inhibit movement, and so now the story has become a bit more complex. But that was the marker where people thought about the STN. And then we also, so a bit later, 1950s roughly, lesions to the GPI and also the ventrolateral thalamus blocked hemibalism. So people then even started to do pallidotomy, in this case in monkeys, that had hemibalism, which were unilaterally, which were induced by also lesioning the STN before. So simply stated, the STN was lesioned, hemibalism was there, then the GKI was lesioned, and it stopped. And then they also had one patient here, thalamotomy, that helped also ameliorate the ballistic movements. Then next marker maybe was to find out that the pallidum, especially the internal pallidum, was a big output region. So together with the substantia nigra, the GPI, so these yellow two are basically considered as, and that's the SNR, so the reticular part, as the output regions of the basal ganglia. So these two link to the thalamus and then back to the cortex. And as you may know, we have these three streams going down from the motor cortex to the striatum, and then there's a direct and indirect pathway, and the hyperdirect goes basically directly to the SDN from the cortex. And at this stage, people recognize the GPI and SNR to be like the head ganglions or the output regions of the basal ganglia. And then in the 60s, we had the first levodopa effects, and people associated then dopamine depletion in Parkinson's disease, with Parkinson's disease. So a lack of dopamine at the time was associated with Parkinson's symptoms, and that's probably still true. Then you give levodopa and you had a better, like, effective treatment of the systems. And then I guess one important concept that came up in the 70s was the selection function of the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia to be considered as the selection device in the brain. So the concept, very simply stated, was that you have different options for actions that are somewhere in the neocortex, and then the basal ganglia select between these competing regions in a loop system, and then the one that wins will be executed. And like a clearinghouse, it was called, and also very important to suppress all others. And there's a famous quote by Hassler, who was a neurosurgeon, I think even in Germany. Basal ganglia at the same time focus the attention, emotional participation, and excitability of one single event by simultaneously suppressing and fading all other happenings and motivational objects. So here we also have already the attention and emotion, plus also the movement, so we can already see that basal ganglia are not only involved in movement, but also in emotion and associative selection functions. This is the scheme. So we have three competing ideas in the cortex, and then in this case the basal ganglia would say C is best, so they select C but also suppress A and B, and then C is being executed. Then again, very briefly, in the 80s, the importance for the basal ganglia for the expression of automatic movements. So it was discovered that basal ganglia are involved into getting movements into a more automated and not so much attention-driven behavior. So responsible for automatic execution of learned motor plans, things like bicycling and automatisms where we don't have to think. There, apparently, the basal ganglia are very important for. And then I guess what was really impactful was the classical basal ganglia model, also by Anne Young and colleagues. And so this source is from a, I think, great Nature Reviews Neuroscience paper, which also highlights the historical hallmarks that I showed. And as you may know, this is again the loop system. So we have a direct pathway and an indirect pathway, and it goes up back to the thalamus and back to the cortex. And we have already discussed before that GPI and substantia nigra reticularis are considered outflow regions that go back to the thalamus, and the striatum is basically the input nucleus of the basal ganglia. And then you can imagine the direct pathway really going from input to output directly, and then the indirect pathway goes via GPE and STN, it's I think not so consequential, but rather parallel. But we also know that the striatum, so the direct pathway, has these D1 receptors, and the indirect, the D2 receptors, and then we have the S and C, which serves as a basically as a balance thing, right? So if it is activated, it will be positive on the D1, so it will strengthen the direct pathway, and it will be negative on the D2, so it will stop the indirect pathway. And direct is a bit very easy now, but it's much more complicated in reality, as you may know. But direct is 4 movements, so more direct means more movement, maybe, and indirect means less movement. So if you have more activity here, you get more movement and less not movement, so you get more movement at the end, and it goes up to the thalamus again. So the S and C, which is where a lot of the dopaminergic cells are, and also the VTA, they project to the striatum and are like this balance, and more dopamine will be in a net balance, also more movement making, less inhibition. So and then what happens so I'll show you later. This is a very simple model and it's already outdated, but I think a lot of people think it's still useful. That's why we can still use it to explain different things and even clinical routines. And what happens in Parkinson's disease is basically that we have a loss of these dopaminergic neurons in the compact part of the substantia nigra. And as we've seen what it does before, then it will have less activation of the direct and less stopping of the indirect, so we will have more indirect, and then we'll have in the end less movement, right? So more inhibition of the thalamus in the end, and then less activation of the cortex. And then we can add levodopa up here. Unfortunately, it doesn't work here, it just fixes everything, but it works on the striatum most importantly. And then if we add too much of it, then we have this dyskinetic state, which so this Parkinsonian state, and then we have we add levodopa, and then we get the dyskinetic state, which basically has both more on, and then you have competing indirect and direct, so that's a simple model at least, and then you get dyskinetic movement. This is a more up-to-date version, so you can see there are much more arrows here, and it gets much more complicated to draw predictions. Probably more realistic, but still you can probably explain quite some effects with the simpler model. And then I like didactics, and I really like the Americans. This is actually Canada, but they sometimes are really great in making things very simple, so we can make it even more simple. And we basically just have the putamen and the thalamus, very simple, and we have the direct and indirect pathway. And as I said before, the direct could be seen as a movement, pro-movement thing, and the indirect maybe more as a less moving thing. Right? So if you want to take home only one thing but memorize it, I think it's a working, helpful model. That's an image I made once just to visualize also anatomically how these pathways are even implemented, because we always see these arrow diagrams, but we may not think too much about which anatomical tracts are really involved in this. And basically the striatopallidofugal pathway is coming from the striatum, and it's implemented as Wilson's pencils. So Wilson first described these bundles that go through the striatum, also go through the pallidum, and they have terminals that come in 90 degrees and like disc-like terminals. It's a beautiful system actually. And then even go through Edinger's comb. He was the first to describe this. It's a comb-like system that connects both GPI and SDN, but also GPI and SNR. And then there are thalamus, so lenticulus fascicularis and ansa lenticularis that go back to the thalamus and up there. Another important thing also always to think about is that we have somatotropy in this system. So basically this loop that we just discussed exists for the leg, exists for the arm, but also for the face. And of course everything is a gradient in the brain, right? There are no barriers, but you could draw a lot of trajectories for each part of your motor system. And then it is somatotropically organized throughout the whole basal ganglia loop. And as you can see already here in the SDN, not the whole SDN is covered by this picture. There's a lot of gap here. And what is covered is the motor SDN. So we would even have more like different loops. And you see, okay, no, that will come later. So you will also have a motor loop, associative loop, and limbic loops. So it's a pretty complex system. But then we young people should also not forget how it started basically. So before deep brain stimulation, what people did was actually make lesions. So pallidotomy would be to make a lesion in the pallidum to treat a system. And the subthalamotomy or thalamotomy would basically be the equivalence of pallidum DBS and Lim-DBS and STN-DBS. And that's a really important thing still to think about always if you think about the mechanism of action in DBS, that it has nearly the same effects as a lesion, right? Even though we probably don't make a lesion and we probably rather inhibit information flow, still a lesion would have similar effects than DBS in many cases, in most cases. And then I think modern day deep brain stimulation started with Benavich. At least that's the main story that everybody tells in the 80s, where he's tested before making the lesion with high frequency stimulation in the VIM, and he saw that already with the stimulation the symptoms stopped. So before making the lesion, he wanted to test it and he tried high frequency stimulation, I think for the first time in this case, and then it already worked, and he then won a breakthrough prize by that. But there's also, maybe as a side note, there has been DBS in the 50s already by people like Robert Heath in the US, and there are interesting books about this. So there is a basically history into brain stimulation that has been forgotten a bit or has been neglected. But one slide just about the general setup. Most of you here will know what DBS is, but there are some people that are working with TMS and are more interested in DBS. So just very briefly, what you have is you have a stimulator here, you have cables going up through under the skin, and the surgeon implants this, and then you have the DBS electrodes implanted into the deep structures of the brain. And in this case, we have 8 contacts, and these 2 are made active, and then we have the SDN reconstructed here. Right, so that's a typical setup of DBS. This is a typical surgical routine. You see the frame, and then some videos, and these are now videos by Medtronic, so it's the best situation, of course. But and we have the DBS, so we have an essential tremor patient, and he himself can turn the system on, and then you will see it. The tremor will stop. Great effect, and most of you have probably seen this in real life as well. It's often really this great, right? So you have this really great effect on the tremor. and you turn the system on and tremor is gone. This is Parkinson's, again, best case scenario, so really great video to demonstrate DBS, and you see simultaneously DBS off and on. You have a same day, really different patient. As you may know, it's not always that great, but I've seen at least 15 patients that were this great, where you turn it on and they are more or less normal and you see nothing. So sometimes the treatment can really be beneficent.
At least in the beginning.
At least in the beginning, totally. Effects fade and Parkinson progresses. This is a video that I really like because it's actually on YouTube and the patient himself uploaded it there, and I find it really brave. And he says, "This is me, the video was made one day before my first surgery in 1997. Look at my other parts to see how I am now." And this is a dystonia patient, and dystonia is much rarer than Parkinson's. But there are two crucial points about dystonia. First, in dystonia, I think DBS is nearly the only option, the only real option that we have. Of course, there's botulinum toxin for focal dystonia, but that's why for dystonia patients it's even more important to offer them maybe DBS. And in Parkinson's disease we have at least some good medication, and you can see it's a often generalized form of muscle contractions. And in young, it often happens in children as well already, and then it also leads to deformations of the bones. And now, second video, still me. This was taken 14 days after my surgery, at the day of leaving the hospital. What a difference. At that day, I knew I'm gonna make my driving license, and I did. So it's much better. Still, you see quite some deformed posture, but already it's, at least for him, very much better. But also, you can see that there's much less contractions. And then this is a bit later, where he wrote that he had a cold, so he's even better normally. But where you can see, can talk normally, and he has nearly no acute symptoms anymore. Right? A great difference, and he made his driver's license and put the videos on YouTube, which is really cool. Then also DBS has become a really popular technique, right? So even as just a neuroscientist, where you're just interested in the brain and not so much into medicine at all, it can be a very important window into the brain to record signals from different parts of the brains. So it started in tremor very early, then Parkinson's disease. The first FDA approval was 1997 for essential tremor, then for Parkinson's disease later, then for dystonia. And then we also have a half approval for OCD. And then there were the first Alzheimer's and depression trials as landmarks. These are just publications with deep brain stimulation per year, so you can see really high increase. And what's also interesting for neuroscientists, I think, is that there are so many diseases where DBS at least plays some role, even if it's just theoretical. But a lot of diseases of the brain, nearly every brain disease, somehow people have thought about, could we put an electrode into the brain, right? Andres Lozano always says no neuron is safe, so he's really happy with, so I think some part of this is true, that over the time probably there will be more indications rather than less indications, and there will be other targets that we may be able to analyze also by means of DBS. These are potential mechanisms of action, of like how people think about how DBS works. So as I said before, the effects on the clinics are usually the same as lesions, but there are a lot of theories of how the effects really work, and I'm not an expert into this. But what we tried in Berlin is to generate an accurate model of DBS. So to create basically, to have a computer simulation which we can then use to infer meanings from the brain, and to also then, as I showed you, simulate which tissue parts out of the DBS electrodes are stimulated. Talked about this. That before, sorry. Yeah, this is one case we had in Berlin, which I wanted to show you. And so the stimulation is on in this patient, and we have dyskinesias here, and we also have coughing and grimacing. And this is in the STN. It's a Parkinsonian patient, so this is really rare. Lip smacking, especially coughing. Coughing only comes with DBS, so it's really rare. And we then try to model this patient. So this is stimulation off. This has much better. So you see some dyskinesias maybe, but this is he just tries to show us what happened. So he's, for his sake, much more normal, no coughing and so on.
So it's Deformations on.
This is nets on, yes. Yeah. But the side effects are important here, right? So the coughing, the grimacing, lip smacking, and so on. And then we localized, also very early, localized the DBS electrodes and found one of them, and the one that was important was inside really the red nucleus. So medial to the STN. And then we could show. So this is the right side, and we have the fiber tracts, and we have the bad side, and if you compare the two, they have a different profile also in the brainstem. And this is really hypothetical now, but you could think about different tracts maybe being activated. So very, very hypothetical, but if you have you see, yeah, so extensor muscles, neck, back and limbs, vestibular spinal tract, but also medial ventricles or spinal tract. You have these crude stereotype movements of the limbs. And I wouldn't say this really what happens, but again, this is one idea of what could be, in theory, analyzed with DBS, right? This is, as you may see from the image, also a very old picture with not so nicely looking fiber tracts and all that, but this is the type of studies that one could do. And then also adding like these structural connectivity to your models, even for case reports, if you have really interesting cases, have good imaging on the data, and good videos and so on, you could really learn a lot from that. Okay, so now second part of this talk is how can you really visualize these DBS target regions in patients? So which MRI sequences should we use or can we use to make really good models, right? Because what we want, this is a nicely looking picture maybe, but we really want this to fit the patient's anatomy, and that's a crucial point. And the anatomy in our pipeline will be defined by the preoperative data. Right? So the better our MRIs from the preoperative scans are, the better the models will fit the reality, basically. And then a lot of people ask me, like, which is the best sequence to scan, and this is a normal T1 MP range that a lot of people use for stereotactic planning. It's a post-Gadolino, so we see the contrast enhancement. And we see maybe I can turn the light off for this part of the talk. Yeah, just for these because I show so many MRIs now. So we can maybe see the GPI a bit, but not really, right? I mean, one can see the GPE here, that's the striatum. And maybe if we are on a good monitor, we can see it a bit better. This is the normal T2, and if we're lucky, we can see some shade of SDN here. there are better images as well, but and it's a bit better on my monitor. But then there are these specialized sequences for example, the F8 here sequence, which is a fast gray matter acquisition inversion recovery. And here we can, even though it's just a 3D image, we can really see the GPE, and we can also see the GPI here pretty well. So you can see the lamina medullaris interna, then externa, then there's the striatum. So sequences like that, also on this side, the GPI is pretty well visible. Sequences like that can really help not only for planning, but also then in the end for reconstruction, because the models will fit the data better. And this is again the normality one in comparison. Then maybe for the SDN, there's the QSM, quantitative susceptibility mapping method, which quantifies the iron content and needs to be calculated later based on the images. But here you can really see the subthalamic nucleus pretty well. Has the same problem as the T2, that the substantia nigra is also highlighted, so it's not even much better to differentiate the two, but you still get a good contrast for the SDN. And here you can even see hitting as comms, so the fibers going between GPI and SDN. And yeah, this is again normal T2, so much better than the QSM. And then there are specialized sequences, so more for research, but if you have access to 7 Tesla scanners, I know that here is a really great new imaging center in Shanghai, then there are also these really great specialized sequences, and I'll just show you some examples of what we acquired in Martino Center, which is one of the most famous, I think, imaging centers worldwide. So this is actually my brain, and we now can see not only the GPI, but also the lamina accessorius, so the one that divides the GPI into 2 parts, then GPE and the striatum. And in comparison to the T1, of course, this is a much better picture. And then here we see the subthalamic nucleus, we see the red nucleus, and then here Edinger comes, so these fibers going to the GPI are really well visible. So this is really great, such data. And here we also have a pretty nice differentiation between SDN and the nigra below it. Right? So it's a clear, I would say, clear cut. And you can really use these images to do great stuff. And one problem with the SDN, to make things even more complicated, is that the part that we're interested in, so the sensory motor part, seems to have less iron than the anterior part. So it's less hypointense on the T2s, especially with low field strengths. This has been reported quite often and replicated quite often, so I somehow believe it now. And this is the same image, again my brain, but we have some nigra here as well, so it's this is actually wrong. But if we compare now the T2, it's co-registered, so it's the same image, and we would say maybe it stops here, then we're pretty sure that there is some more SDN back here, where we even see it's getting a bit lighter towards the end. So maybe the SDN stops actually here, around here, I would say, in this part. And so the image is wrong, so it would probably be here, this the line where the SDN stops. And then you can even, in post-mortem, you can even be much more deliberate. I don't know why monitor doesn't show it now. Somehow the monitor froze, you know. with post-mortem imaging, people in the Martino Center, they scan the brain the whole weekend at very high resolution, and then you get really beautiful anatomical images that you can only dream of in a clinical setting, right? So here again we have the GPI, and this is this accessorious lamina that divides the GPI into two parts, and we have the GPE. This is actually, you know what that is, anyone? This structure? AC, exactly. So before, I must admit, before I saw these pictures, I didn't know that the AC actually goes to the temporal lobes. So it goes all the way back there, and striatum, and all these fibers in the internal capsule and the thalamus. So these are really beautiful images then that you can use to study anatomy and so on. And it's really unfortunate that we cannot, in our patients, get similar images of this quality. So I think it froze again. It's also a bit hot. No, not really. But I think they want to publish these. There's one, you can send you the link that's similar. So comparison now, post-mortem and my brain, fortunately not post-mortem, still a big difference, right? So it's really cool what you can do with an MRI if you scan the whole weekend. And then this is the 3 Tesla, also my brain, same day actually, and really big difference. So this is not 7 but 9.4. Yes?
We don't have better option this time. We can try another computer, but
Okay.
so let me just switch it on.
Okay, I can try that. That's good. Then another option, of course, for anatomy is just block phase, so to cut the brain, and there we fortunately also have one data from Jacob Farnese from San Diego, which has these block phases of the whole brain in really good slices, and we use that to also inform our atlas to be sure that we mark the right part. And then what's really nice there, you can also create videos where you can see all the anatomical details and look at all the structures. So yeah, maybe with this talk I wanted to make you a bit hungry about anatomy and about good imaging. And because it's really interesting, I really like the anatomical work as well. Then, not to forget the old work, the old world. This is actually from the 1900s, and all this is openly accessible in the internet. And there are so many beautiful paintings of the anatomists at the time, and often their texts are much more detailed, and there are so many connections that haven't been shown before. So also can only motivate you to dive into the old anatomy world, actually, because it's unfortunate that I sometimes think imaging, the new imaging, killed this, and there's so much wealth in the old literature that now is somehow lost because people only look at MRIs. And here we can see beautifully, again, the GPI, also with the accessorious lamina, GPE, putamen, the internal capsule, Eddinger's comb, thalamus, and medullaris, I think. And we can also even use this information to inform our modern studies. Just some more beautiful pictures. That's by Winkler, French anatomist, also 1980 or so. And bit newer data showing you the complexity of the regions that we're interested in. So we have this STN here, and we have the zona incerta, we have the fasciculus lenticularis, internal capsule, and internal capsule is a complex structure. We always think it's just some fibers, but there's a lot going on, as you can see. So, and our task in DBS imaging is to model all this, and it's really a complicated task. This was just a very first description of STN, actually by Forel, 1877. So apparently he was the first one to describe this nucleus, and this is the cytology that he drew of it. Unfortunately, there are still a few people in modern day neuroscience that still do this stuff. This is data from Jülich, and this is a big brain project where we see the STN, and that's openly accessible. So it's a whole brain in very high resolution. It's called Big Brain. You can Google it or Baidu it. And we can see even that the STN seems to be divided into multiple parts, with a cell denser and iron denser part, and less iron dense and cell dense part up here. And the same group also does the polarized light imaging. So they cut up the brain and they use polarized light to study the anatomy more of the fiber tracts. And these are the pencils I talked about. So this is the direct and indirect pathway coming from the striatum through the pallidum and then going, so being indirect if it stops here, GPE, and then goes to GPI, but being direct if it goes directly through, and then goes to the substantia nigra, not really through here, and the STN through Eddingers-Combe, and completes the loop going up to balance. Yeah, that's my brain. I just showed that already, and I guess that's this talk. Questions so far?
Could you talk to the pathway theory that the hypothesis that hyper-directed pathway could be provided the clinical outcome of DBS? There is still hypothesis, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But this January, McIntyre published he opened the support this hypothesis. So I wonder how this could present wrong truths or any ideas.
So I'm probably also not the best person to answer this, but my thought is that, so I when I started, I also thought direct pathway seems to be the target, because there's the Gradi-Naru science paper where they stimulated directly with optogenetics the hyperdirect pathway, and that seems to have worked. But Julian from our lab, he's much more a fan of the indirect pathway, so he would say that's the main thing. And I more and more believe it's really a loop problem in the loop, and that can be tackled by different parts of the loop, I think. So I would even believe that with DBS you can induce this noise to stop the pathological behavior that's probably oscillating the beta rhythm somewhere. You can maybe stop. Yeah, you can maybe stop it everywhere. You know, maybe not everywhere, but that could be one reason why you can put an electrode into STN and also GPI, and both have a good effect in Parkinson's disease, because somehow I feel DBS is disrupting information flow, and you have pathological information flow that's looping around, and maybe anywhere in the loop or at many parts in the loop you can stop it. But as I said, I'm not really an expert in this, more the imaging person. Okay, so this was more theory, but we will now soon start with, actually we will start now to use Lead-DBS and then go to normalization. So, do you need a break, or are you still happy? Okay, let's move on. Let's start to load up our patient, the one that we will process in this course, and we will now do the co-registration of these files. And how can you do that? So most of you probably know, you go into MATLAB and you type in Lead-DBS, right, to start it. And once that works, you can, for example, you can drag the folder with our files onto this window, right? That would be a way to open it. The other way is to click on this button here, and then we open course examples base files. I think it's called differently in your case, probably example patient or something. Yeah. And so for the people that are really new to it, the software is structured in a way that we have these steps 1, 2, 3, and so on. And you basically go through that. Each time you press run, it will execute everything that is selected. And we load the patient up here, and we say which electrode it is and how many leads we have. So in this case, we have a right lead and a left lead, but we could also say it has maybe 2 more leads, so we can then click on these. And with this thing, we can quick select the last patients that we had selected, right? So we can just reopen this patient and now it will be loaded. Here you already see that we have quite a lot of electrodes that are implemented here. So we also have the pins electrodes from China, but in this case we actually have a directed lead. So we will select the Boston Scientific Versailles directed. And maybe as a general idea, you can now choose to either select our patient and just do that, or if you have your own patient data, you can also use that, right? So maybe a bit safer with ours because we know it will work and so on, but if you prefer to use your own patient data, that's also fine. And then usually what we do, but we can skip here, is to import the DICOM files to Nifty formats. And DICOM files are the ones that the scanner produces and you can get off the MRI scanner, but Nifty files.nii are more common in the neuroimaging world, and we will use that. And so the base files in this folder, we have a T1, which is the T1 image preoperative. So all the preoperative images are called ANAT underscore T1. Then we have a T2. So pretty good quality, I think, 2mm resolution and 0.6 resolution in plane. And we have T2 star, that's just a slab, so not a whole brain coverage, right? And then what else do we have? We have proton density that usually people don't have, I think, and we don't really need it, but we have it here. Then we have this F gate here that I showed you, which is a basic ganglia sequence for this patient. And then postoperatively we have the CT, which I cannot quick look here because it's too large, but it's a good resolution postoperative CT image. Right? So you should have all these files in your folder.
Can you just give those who don't have Mac advice how to do that?
Yes. So yeah, what I'm doing here with this quick look is pretty convenient for Mac users, and it's possible with a tool that is called DTI TK Quick Look plugin. So if you have a Mac, I can really recommend to install this. Oh, it works. That's good. Okay, and for PC, for Windows, I think a good option to double click and open images is MRI Pro. Yeah. So that's
for Linux.
Sorry?
Linux?
For Linux as well would also work. MRI Pro. And another option, a small lightweight image viewer, is called Mango. Maybe you know different ones. not mine go like that. So mine go ruler. And that's this one. And it's just a small viewer. So then you would need to double click them and you'll get a view like that. I think that's an old version of MRI Cron now, but you can look at them. Hey. Alright, so everybody should have the patient folder and Lead-DBS and load the patient folder. And we will now skip the import step, but we would go to the first real step, which is co-register volumes. And we only select this one and nothing else, and then we press run. Right? And what then happens is that Lead-DBS will do some pre-processing, like general pre-processing things. So first of all, it will do a bias field correction step, which tries to get rid of some inhomogeneities of the MRI, of the B0 field. And it also reorients and crops images to make them more useful in a neuroimaging pipeline. And after that, it will do the co-registration. And maybe just to recap, and co-registration is the linear part that we've talked about. And it's basically trying to register all the preoperative data and all the postoperative data to one image. And this one image to which it registers everything is the T1 usually, if you have a T1. And we sometimes call this the anchor modality, like an anchor of the boat, of the ship. So the anchor modality is T1 by default. You can change that if you want, but by default. And it will register the T2, the PD, the F-gate here, and all of them into the T1 space, but also the postoperative CT into T1 space. So in the end, we hopefully will get all images in T1 space. And yeah.
And which algorithm would you choose for it?
Yeah, so I think the defaults are actually pretty good, which is SPM for MRI to MRI and then ANS for CT to MRI. But we will, in the next step, check the results, and if it doesn't work, you can then choose a different option. So I would think start with defaults.
Because the default image FX1 could be quite dominant in the African side. So I wonder if I choose
Flirt to register, yeah, it's just slower. That's the main reason. But yeah, Flirt is also yeah.
I have a question.
Yes?
If at last we check the result is not work good, so we should to change the method or just use this method to run more times.
You should then change the method. We'll go through it, what to do. So in our patient, this should work now, because I've tried it back home. But if it doesn't work, you can then use a different step, a different method for this. And I would even say that for linear registrations, it's fine to mix the methods. Because in the end, for normalization, I would not do that. But for linear registrations, I think it's okay to mix the methods, because in the end, every method will always produce this one matrix that we talked about. And all of them use mutual information, so they're very similar, is what I'm saying, and they should not introduce a systematic bias. So we see the fans going up, that's good. A lot of power.
And how about the right or left electrode? I need to choose in this program.
So the default will be right and left are on, right?
Yeah.
But if you have more, you could choose more. Yeah.
And if we are using just one, the right will be the one and the second.
Yeah.
Because we were trying to do that. We have one and so we press the left one, there was a bug.
There was a bug there.
What happens when you are doing the
Yeah, that should work, but it might not every function will work. We have fixed a lot of bugs recently about
I have the
this.
same problem. I think it goes.
I think so. So if it's just about visualizing, it should not work. Okay, so maybe a few more general things while we wait. So I just opened up a different Lead-DBS in a different window to show you. So one thing that might be interesting is that you can choose whether you want to play a sound if the tasks are completed or not. You can disable that. And there's also this small methods window pop up that some of you might have seen. You can also disable that here. So in my case it's disabled, so I don't want this to pop up all the time. But this is an option. And then there's also the preferences file, which can be really important to change things. You can open it here. And this will be code, so it's not so accessible, but sometimes, if we tell you on Slack, maybe change the preferences, then this is how you open it. And there's also the option to reset the preferences to default, right? So if you have made an error in the preferences file, you can always just reset it. And one other thing that a few people don't know is that you can also choose multiple patients in Lead-DBS, right? So you can, so if we have our patients here, we check, we can have we have these 6 patients, we can also load all of these patients. And now you will see that there are now 6 patients loaded in Lead-DBS. And if we do co-registration, it will do all of these patients after each other, right?
Parallel.
We'll do after each other. But if you want to parallelize, then you can do that in the preferences file. There's the very first entries are parallelized processing, do it, and then if you put this to 1, it will parallelize. Right? So if you have a really good machine and you process thousands of data or hundreds of patients, then this can really be helpful. What's more is that you can also, instead of running these, you can submit the jobs to a cluster if you configure it correctly. So I used this a lot in the medical school compute cluster. I had Lead-DBS open and instead of pressing run, I would submit jobs to different compute nodes. So it needs configuration, but ask us for help if you want to do that. So there are multiple ways of doing it. And then the other thing, so we just said co-register volumes and we pressed run, but we can also export code here, right? So we can click this button and it will then create a job file, and that job file will be a MATLAB file, and it will have all these options there, and it will then run Lead-DBS. So if we click run here now, we'll do exactly the same as if we had clicked run before. So for people that want to write code or estimate or build pipelines, this is how you could export a job and modify it. Okay. So now mine is done, and what we could do next is to check whether registration results are accurate. And so this might be a bit unintuitive that we have to skip these two steps now. But the check results window will check results for everything up here, right? So we can do that now. We can say check results, press run, and then it will open a window which shows us the registration results between each pair of images. And, we can then use that to look at or make sure that all of the registrations are correct. Are most of you done already, or is it still running? Still running. Okay, so we'll wait some time. One other more general thing about Lead-DBS is that you can change the space. So we will talk a bit more about the M&I space in the next talk actually, but there are also different options. So if you don't like the M&I space for some reason, I would say most of you should just use it, but you know, maybe there's some good reason why you want to use a different space. So if you work with monkeys, someone was here with monkeys, with macaques, with non-human primates. You work with primates?
Yeah.
Here. Primates?
Yeah.
So if you have primate data with pre and post-operative imaging, you could actually use an M&I space of a macaque and then do the same, right? So it should work. It's involved, but this is actually where we can use a different space, and you have to basically install them and have a good reason to change it, but it's possible.
Could you introduce street SLS and also HTTP9?
They're actually not real spaces. So this is actually my brain. And what this one, the Aho, isn't also not published. It's from Sao Paulo. They have a really good big brain-like data set. So you know Eric Frohnhoff, who was in Beijing. So his Aho works for Eric Frohnhoff, and we collaborate on some of their data. So yeah, but the other thing is that probably, as I said, most of you will probably not even use the spaces function at all. What you can then still do is, if you change to a space, you could still import the atlases from your M&I space, so that you would have also atlases in different spaces. That should work, so Lead-DBS can then really import stuff between spaces, and limitations apply because there's always an error, but you can use your own stereotactic space. The other thing that can be helpful is later if you use not only Lead-DBS but also other tools, we can load the current patient also in Lead Connectome, for example, and we'll now have the same subjects loaded, still running, but in Lead Connectome now we have all these subjects that we had here in this different pipeline where we can do connectomics, right? So this can sometimes be very helpful to switch between tools. And what else is there? I think, yeah, and maybe
Introduce how the integrate with 3D slicer to manually correct.
yes, I can try. I haven't written this, but I can try. Let's do that after the registration check. So that's actually Tushara Pereira from Australia who has written that, and I've never used it, but I've tried it once, so I can try it. The other options maybe are in tools, and there are quite some options that sometimes can be useful. So, for example, you can calculate the signal to noise ratio for selected subjects, or you can do different types of options. And for example, you can also then map files from the T1 space to the template space to this and so on. So some more options. But what Tianje mentioned was the slicer integration, and I think for that to work, you need to edit the preference file.
One line code.
And then if you search, so with Command F for slicer,
Where you use it.
yeah, then you have to put in the path to 3D slicer. So in my case, it's just applications and the slicer.tab. But depending on your system, it should probably be .exer, and it needs to be the full path to that. And you save that, and after that, we now have co-registered it. Now I should be able to press this button, and it will load up 3D slicer, and we can then also look at the co-registration of these volumes. But I'm not really prepared to do this. So we can, I know it works. So I can see here now we have now actually all the images, right? So we have the T1 and the post.ct and so on, and you can look at the T1, and then we can look at the registration between the two. Right. So how is it still running or done? Maybe raise your hand if it's done. Lovely. Okay, looks good. Alright, so now you can do what I've just done. So you deselect the co-register, but then check results button and run again. Now this image should appear. And it basically gives us a rough view of the registration between the T2, in this case, and the anchor modality, which is the T1. And what you see is the T2, but you see in red, these red wires here, the edges of the T1, right? So it says red wires are based on the T1, and the T2 is basically what we see. And you can probably already see that the wires of the T1 are pretty well aligned with the T2. So if you are known to these images, you can probably just say this is okay, and we leave it. But there's also the detail viewer button up here. If you click that, there actually is a bug here. Do you all get the same error, or does it work in your case? So it works here. That's good. Did you all get the same error as I got? Okay, some of you. Okay, maybe hopefully I fix it now and then we can fix it together. Give me 1 second. I'm sorry about this. So maybe we need to fix this together so it works in your case. So maybe you can go to MATLAB and then type open blank EA underscore. Or let's see. Yeah. EA check go rec. And then press enter.
Andy, can you enlarge the screen? Very small.
Let's try. Let's see. I think what's easier is that I send you this file and you replace it. Maybe that's easier. Okay, so I'll send you an email with this file, and if you can replace it. The other option is that you find the file EA underscore check correct. That's directly in Lead-DBS, and then in line number 88 you can enter this. I don't know how to make it bigger. It needs to be or replace the file. Or the other option is to just ignore it for now and we'll just look at the viewer on my computer. Yes. Sorry about that. It was actually fixes for the course that they broke something else. So you are already becoming programmers now. It's great. But don't worry if it doesn't work. It's not so important to see this viewer. I mean, what we see here now, if it works, is a viewer of the T1, and if we click, we see the T2, right? So we see the co-registration between T1 and T2. And remember, T1 in this case is the anchor modality. You can also scroll through. the image and then really look at the fuse or the co-registration between the two files. Right? So this is a good way if you're not so sure, just based on the image we saw before. So this is a quick look of the registration. I would already say this is good. There's no need to look at it because I see everything and I see that the fuse is really good. But then if you press on detail viewer and if it works, then you get this viewer and you can scroll through it, and you could also click and look at T1 versus T2 window. Right? One other option that we have is to press X here. If we press X, we see one file in orange and the other file in blue. And if they are nicely registered, it should look like this. If not, there would be like ghosting artifacts at the edges. Right? There would be maybe double lines here if it's not well registered. And then you can scroll through the image. You can also click on S for sagittal view. So up here the commands and C for coronal view. And so you can look at the image in all dimensions and scroll through it and so on. Okay. So but for co-registration, we should really check all co-registrations. We need the line again. And make sure that it all works. So does everybody who wants to fix it has fixed it, or do we need more time with this, or shall we just ignore it for now? What do you think? So it will be of course fixed soon in the next version, but yeah, this is what always happens. But one important part now is that we can either disapprove or approve this image, this view, right? And this is actually a pretty important thing that I want you to understand. So if we approve it, that means we tell Lead-DBS that it is a good registration and it should not touch it anymore. Right? So next time you open this patient, it will not show you this anymore. And that really helps if you process a lot of patients and you have hundreds of them, and the ones that are approved that it will not show them to you again and again and again, but you say once they're good and then it's fine.
Can I distinguish that from the green?
Sorry?
So if I load a patient which is co-registered already, next time when I open this patient, can I distinguish that from the green? Is it deactivating the checkbox, or how can I
No,
tell?
but so we will do it now. So we will approve this one now, right? And it shows you the next one. But now we can just maybe close the image, close this figure, and if we will rerun this now, it will not show us the T2 again, right? Because we already approved it. If we wanted to show us everything, then we have to select this thing here, retouch override. Then it will always show you everything. But if you don't have that on, it will not show you the T2 then, because it's approved, and why waste your time, right? So now it starts with the PD that we haven't approved yet. So this is a general, in the overall workflow, approving things or everything that you do manually and say save, then Lead-DBS will not bother you with it again if you don't specifically ask for it. And it can really be helpful later. If you have a lot of patients and so on, then maybe if this one wouldn't work, we could just say disapprove for now, but process the rest of the 100 patients, and then we can deal with the ones that we disapprove later. So this is what this is about. And if it wouldn't work now, so if this is also a really good registration, the PD versus the T1. But if this wouldn't be good, we could directly in here recompute only this specific registration, but then maybe use a different method here, right? So we could say now we tried SPM before, but we want to do ANDs for this specific registration. Okay. But in this case, also nice, we can improve it, and then it will show us the next one, which is this F gate here. 2T1 also looks really nice, nicely registered, so we can also improve this one. And then this is the T2 star, also just a slab image, but also nicely registered. We can improve it. Afterwards, it should show us the CT now, right? So this is the post-operative CT. We see the electrodes here. We see it has been done with ANDs, with T1 and the CT. And this is also a nice registration, so we can also approve it. Okay. So what we've done now is we have registered everything to T1 space. Okay. And what you can see, if you click on patient directory down here, then it will open the directory. And remember, we started with just a few files here, but now we have quite some more files. And what are these? So it made a copy of the original data, the raw anatomic data. And actually the ones up here are the already co-registered T1 space data. On a Mac you can even see that we approved these. These are green now, so these are good registrations. It only works on Mac, but they would be red if we would have disapproved them. And then, what else do we have? We have the post-operative CT, and we have the registered post-operative CT. And down here, this is just a copy of the CT, which is a tone-mapped version. And so tone-mapped means that you can see both the brain and the CT window in one view. So it's better to look at for registrations. That's also green because we have approved this registration. And then one other thing that might be helpful is this methods text file, which just protocols what we have done, right? So it adds a timestamp, it adds the date and the time, which code was called, and then it also gives you a small methods text. Post-operative CT was co-registered to ANAT1 using a two-stage linear registration, rigid followed by fine, blah, blah, blah. And you even have a citation of this tool that you used. Right? So that can be helpful in writing papers, maybe. And what else? That's it, I think. That's the important thing. Then in CheckRack, we have also these images that we have seen before, right? So you can also manually check inside of the patient folder. You already have these files. Questions so far? Okay, so what we could do now, if you are on board, we can run the normalization while I start with the talk and about normalization. And that would be just normalized, but we will use not the default here, but instead we will use the SPM segment. Right, so this one. In this case, the ANDs would fail because it's a skull strip image, because I had to anonymize this one. Right, so you've seen, it's a patient data, and I had to get rid of the brain, and this would fail in this case. Plus, SPM segment is also a really good method based on our results, so it's actually also a default. It's the second default, I would say. So, and it's much faster. That's the other thing. So for this demonstration, we would now use SPM12 segment nonlinear, press normalize, and then we can also maybe already calculate the next step. So you can select these two, and then press run, and then I'll tell you some more about normalizations.